and begin with 10 truths about truth. A statement is true if it corresponds to reality, and a statement is false if it does not correspond to reality. Today is Sunday would be a false statement, wouldn't it? Because today is actually Thursday. And the reason it's a false statement is because it's not actually Sunday. Now, one could say, well, that all depends on what calendar you're using. So let's assume we're using the same calendar. And upon that assumption, we can say that the statement today is Sunday is definitely not a true statement because it isn't based on the calendar that we're using. All truth claims are absolute, narrow, and exclusive. You see, the statement today is Thursday, being a true statement, would exclude every other possible day as an answer, talking about what time it is, what day it is here, right now, in this time zone. So we can remove all those other exceptions. It would exclude today is Friday. It would exclude today is Saturday, and so forth. Truth claims, by their nature, have that power to put everything else that it is not in correspondence with the truth claim in a position of being excluded. Truth is discovered, not invented. It exists independently of anyone's knowledge of it. For example, 2 plus 3 would equal 5 long before we invented numbers. We had to give names to the values, but the values and the equation that we just talked about would still have been true, even if it had never been written. The chemical composition of water, what is that? 2 atoms of hydrogen, 1 atom of oxygen. Well, it didn't become that when we discovered it. It was already the case that water is H2O, and then we discovered it. Truth is indispensable for living. Consider the need for truth in matters relating to safety. Took your car to the mechanic and told him he had brake problems. The brakes have been going out, almost got in a car accident, and he charges you $500 for doing work on the brakes. And you ask him, are the brakes in good shape? He says yes. You try to drive it off the parking lot, and you can't stop the car. You would be right to go back in and ask, why did you lie? Because indeed, he hadn't tested it. The brakes aren't right yet, and we need that kind of truth in order to have safety. How about money? You go to a store, you buy an item for $5. Let's assume there's no tax. Wouldn't that be great? And you hand the cashier a $20 bill. The cashier looks at you and hands you back $5 and says, "Thank you very much," then turns to the next customer and says, "Next." And you hopefully stand right where you're at and say, "Wait a second, you didn't give me back the right change." And you tell the cashier, "I bought this item for $5. I gave you a 20, and you gave me back $5. That's not enough change." "No, I gave you enough change," he says. No, we have to have a shared number system in order for this economy to work. You did not give me the right change. You would insist that. How could you possibly be involved in any kind of contractual arrangements regarding the payments if you didn't have a belief that truth was necessary? How about relationships? A person claims that they're going to be faithful to their wife, and then right after they get married, he's climbing over the fence and he's checking out the neighbor next door and going in the back door and basically spending the night with her. Comes back the next morning and slips into bed, and the wife says, "Where have you been?" "Well, I was just next door." And she says, "I thought you said you were going to be faithful." And the man says, "Well, I'm faithful. I'm back here. I'm here in the bed right with you." Well, this should have been worked out before you got married about what you meant by faithful, because obviously there are two different understandings here, and without truth, there can't be any trust. And transportation. If somebody asks you directions to Lake Michigan, of course that's relative to where you're at. If you were in Michigan, they would tell you to go due west, and that would be correct. But here, you would be told, most of us, if we're in the northwest suburbs, would be told to go due east. And due west would not be the accurate answer. I mean, you could eventually get there, going all the way around the world, but it wouldn't really be the answer that you were hoping for when you asked directions. And in court proceedings, you realize that the basis for the conviction of a person is that the defendant has been found guilty beyond reasonable doubt. In other words, that they've exhausted reasonable doubts, and there are none left. And the jury of his peers or her peers says this person is guilty. And that is an attempt to do the best one can with the truth, and so that we don't make hasty convictions. Truth is indispensable. Beliefs cannot change a fact. There was a time when everybody believed that the earth was, pretty much everybody believed that the earth was flat. I mean, frankly, if you think about it, all of your experiences, if you've basically been on surface, is this is a flat earth. I mean, things don't roll away from you. And even I had a friend who wondered if perhaps looking out at a big body of water, we couldn't tell that the earth was rounded, because eventually there's a line there called the horizon. But it never dawned on me. I just figured I just couldn't see that far, and that it just kept on going. So yes, there was a time when most everybody believed the earth was flat. And then we discovered that the earth is spherical. Now, it didn't become spherical when people began to believe it. It had always been so. Beliefs cannot change a fact. Truth is transcultural. There may be different ways of describing it in different languages and so forth, but once they have been translated, we will recognize that the truth claim will be the same, because it doesn't matter what culture a person is from. Truth is that which corresponds to reality, and a true statement is one that lines up with what really is the case. Being raised in a given culture doesn't make the beliefs of that culture true. It certainly means that those beliefs will be, thought about by most of the people in that culture, and most of the people will probably believe those beliefs. That's why they call them beliefs, but it certainly doesn't make the beliefs of that culture true. Truth is not affected by the attitude of the one professing it, and that's really a good thing, because each one of us has our days in which we probably don't have the world's best attitude, but we ought not to be distrusted when we make truth claims, even though our attitude isn't 100%. Frankly, I could learn I could learn mathematics from somebody who had bounced their checks. They could still be good at math. They just kind of lapsed. I could learn things about families from someone whose family had failed and she'd been divorced. That doesn't mean that person couldn't teach us good, true things about families. You see, truth is not affected by the attitude of the one professing it. What makes a statement true? Well, it's true if it corresponds to reality. Contrary beliefs are possible, of course. It's one of the silliest things I've ever heard is people saying, I have a right to my opinion. And yes, obviously you do. You don't have a right to having your opinion declared to be true just because you have it, nor do I. And frankly, I don't know how I could take away someone's right to have an opinion without doing some sort of brain manipulation. And people who are totally enslaved or in prison, they still have opinions, even though their freedom has been taken from them. Doesn't stop the freedom of belief. But contrary truths are not possible. That's the nature of truth. It excludes all other statements about that particular state of affairs except for the true one. We can believe everything is true, but we cannot make everything true. Oh, there have been times I wished that I had $1 million in my checking account. I could try hard to believe it and conceive it, and then I can achieve it, but I still don't have $1 million. I can't make that true just by believing it. So we recognize truth then is anchored to the idea of reality. And the reasons for this have to do with something called the three laws of rational thought. And they were first articulated by a thinker named Aristotle, but they existed before he gave voice to them and systematized them. The principle of identity, it is what it is. The principle of non-contradiction, it is not what it isn't. And the principle of the excluded middle, it either is or it isn't. The principle of identity, it is what it is, amounts to one must be able to say if a thing is A, whatever you put in the place of A, then it is A. A thing, object or person or entity or concept can't continue to exist and at the same time cease to exist. Notice this is present tense. A thing that is A today might dissolve and disintegrate and not be A in a few years, but this statement talks about in this moment, if a thing is A, then it is A. That's the principle of identity. It is what it is. For example, if it's a cat, then it's a cat. If Springfield's the capital of Illinois, then it's true that Springfield's the capital of Illinois. This is so basic. Intuitively, it's one of those things that you just sort of say, duh, of course. How could it otherwise be? The second law is the principle of non-contradiction. It is not what it isn't. One must be able to say if a thing is A, then it is not non-A. And you see, a thing can't be itself and its opposite in the same sense at the same time. Now, a person could say, I am here, but I'm not here. And we would have to evaluate that, and we might conclude that when they said I am here, they meant physically in this space, and then when they said I am not here, they meant I've drifted in my mind to a beautiful sunny beach scene. Well, that's not the same definition of here in both sentences. We can't say I am here physically and I'm not here physically. That would be a contradiction. There ought to be a pretty quick reaction in our mind when we hear a contradiction. If it's a cat, then it's not a non-cat, is one example. A cannot equal non-A in the same sense at the same time. And the third one, it either is or it isn't, the principle of the excluded middle. One must be able to say a thing is either A or non-A. So a thing must be either exactly as it is described or not as it is described. It's either a cat or it's a non-cat. Either Springfield's the capital of Illinois or it's not the capital of Illinois. Now, there was a time when Springfield wasn't the capital of Illinois. There's a city down southern Illinois called Vandalia that was a state capital for a while. But that's not the case now. Now, these three laws make it possible for you to speak or write a statement and expect it to be understood and accepted or rejected or shelved, awaiting more information. When you talk, then your truth claim either should be accepted or rejected or set aside until someone has enough information to determine whether it is in correspondence with reality or not. Those are the three options. What can't happen if one intends to be considered rational is to respond to a truth claim in these ways. That may be true for you, but not for me. Everything is merely an opinion, and each opinion is as good as another. Do you want to be driving over a bridge made by an engineer who believed that? I don't think so. You can believe it's up, and I can believe it's down. We can both be right. If you think it is, then it is. If you think it isn't, then it isn't. It's all in a person's mind. The reason I bring this up is because I understand that our culture is sort of under the sway or the influence of something called postmodernism, as if it's even better than what was modern. But it's actually a big devolution. It's actually a big step down. It's actually disintegrates rational thinking. And you may have heard the sentiments of postmodernism described through a number of popular statements. Nothing is certain. Nobody knows anything for sure. Everything ought to be doubted. And what is true for you may not be true for me. Let's take a look at these. Now, if you really respect a person, you listen to what they say. And if you have a question about what they say, you ask them the question. So when I hear somebody say nothing is certain, I have to ask, is this statement certain? And if so, then it contradicts itself, since one thing is certain, that nothing is certain. If this statement isn't certain, then why is it stated in such certain terms? This is a universal negative. Nothing is certain. Not one thing. Either way, I must conclude that this statement is false. Nobody knows anything for sure. Can I know this for sure? Now, let's be honest. I can imagine a circumstance in which a person would say this, or in which a person would say, nothing is certain. Probably they were certain about one thing and it fell through. Maybe it was a job. Maybe it was a romance. Maybe it was plans for a vacation. I don't know. That fell through. And in a fit of desperation, they throw their hands up and say, nobody knows anything for sure, or nothing is certain. But let's be honest now, because we're talking about the way people think about truth. And here, if somebody says nobody knows anything for sure, I think I'd be right to ask them, can I know this for sure? If I can know this for sure, then the statement contradicts itself. And if I can't know this for sure, then why is it stated so surely in such forceful, confident language? Is the basis for a lot of postmodernist statements unbridled emotion? It seems as if the postmodernist believes this to be a certainty. And if he does, then the statement contradicts itself. Either way, I must conclude that this statement also is false. Everything ought to be doubted. Does this include the statement, everything ought to be doubted? And if it does include the statement, everything ought to be doubted or must be doubted, then I must doubt that everything ought to be doubted. That means there's something I'm not going to be doubting, and I'll either end up rejecting the statement or accepting it. If I refuse to doubt the above statement, I'll be creating a do not doubt box. And that's what should go in that box, is the statement. I've exempted the statement from being doubted. If I put anything in this box, however, I refute the above statement. It's an interesting thing about doubt. In order to doubt, you have to have some basis for alleviating doubt. You wonder if what they said was true, and you can put the statement to a test. And if it fails that test, then you know it wasn't true, but you don't know yet. So you merely doubt it rather than reject it. But you have standards for determining whether that doubting process can be pursued to its hopeful conclusion, which would be, okay, they were telling me the truth, or unfortunately, they didn't tell me the truth. I can't put everything ought to be doubted in the do not doubt box. So if I do decide to doubt the above statement, what criterion will I use to determine if the statement can survive my doubting process and become a certainty? There's got to be some fixed point of reference for doubt to take place, and then that becomes something that cannot be doubted. But that violates the statement, because everything ought to be doubted. If I can't find a criterion, I can't start doubting. Either way, I must conclude that the above statement is false. What's true for you may not be true for me. Obviously, this statement must apply to itself, as well as to all other truth claims. If so, then the above statement is true for you, but not necessarily for me. So if it's not true for me, then I must be open to the idea that there are some things that are true for you that are also true for me. And there must be a jointly held truth box we both can access. How we decide what belongs in it requires criteria we can both agree about. And the criteria become some things that are both true for you and true for me and for everyone. This means the statement above is false. What we have here is 4 examples of self-referential incoherence. This occurs when a statement cannot be true if it's applied to itself. You see, all 4 of the postmodern creed truth claims that I've just listed are this way. The only way they can be true is if they're false. This results in a self-contradicting set of beliefs. The law of non-contradiction is essential to rational thinking for me to be able to say I'm a reasonable person. I'm engaging in a reasonable mental activity here. Therefore, this postmodernist creed is irrational. And what we can learn from postmodernism, which is something that developed out of literary critique and maybe art criticism, one man's trash is another man's treasure, or beauty is in the eye of the beholder, those kinds of aesthetic statements, then transferred over to the realm of all statements. What we can learn is that, yes, each person favors his or her own perspective. So from my perspective, this appears to be true. And we can always say that. Whatever the perspective can I start from, but my own. Nevertheless, I'm shaped, but I'm not controlled or determined by my particular perspective. Neither are you. Otherwise, you could never change your mind from the dominant beliefs that are held by those in your particular group. And we know we can do that. We have that freedom, don't we? People usually do have one or more motives when communicating. The postmodernist often says we should check to see why a person has made a statement they believe to be true, and it's probably in order to hang on to power or to increase power or to enhance their standing in the group or in the society. And it's pretty difficult for me to think of a statement I make that has absolutely no motive. Even if I decide I'm behaving altruistically, then I have a motive to be speaking altruistically. I can't seem to get away from motives, but motives aren't what make a statement true or false. The truth value of a statement is not determined by one's motive for making it. What does determine the truth value of a statement? Whether it corresponds with reality, regardless of the motive of the person saying it. Groups have varying metrics of valuation, postmodernists have taught. And of course, that will be the case. There's not one single standard for assuming something is valuable. There are different ways to measure it from one society to another. Those different ways of measuring it do give us an awareness of the distinctives of societies. Nevertheless, we have ways of determining whether a particular set of metrics of valuation is better than another. You see, the presence of many possible answers to a question doesn't mean there isn't one correct answer. Let's take math, for example. 5 times 9 equals 45. You could have said 46, or you could have said 5 million. And lots of people have maybe initially missed that question when they were learning their multiplication tables. The fact that it could be mistakenly answered doesn't rule out the possibility of the right answer. And so we can evaluate the metrics of valuation of one society to another, and we can make some judgments and make some decisions, can't we? My words make best sense to me, and your words make best sense to you. And this is rooted in the idea that no other person has a complete, direct interface of information when words are exchanged, whether that's vocal or written. There's never a guarantee that we have totally understood what that person meant by the words they chose. But our problem isn't total understanding. Our problem is that we want to have reasonable understanding. Beyond reasonable doubt, I suppose, would be another way of talking about the arts of communication. Yes, my words make best sense to me, and the words that you choose are going to make best sense to you. But we're not each locked into our own private language boxes over which we could never communicate. We can understand one another. It's going to take some work, but it's possible. And let's just say we could have a functional and workable understanding of one another, even though we use different words. Everyone has a story, and the postmodernist makes a big deal of this. You know what? Everybody's just basically repeating the story of their group. Their narrative is the word that's often used. Of course, we have stories, but the truth value of a statement is not determined by the place it occupies in one's narrative. The truth value of a statement is determined by whether it corresponds to reality. And we'll move on now. You see, the truth is there must be truth, and this truth entails or requires criteria for evaluating truth claims and minds to do the evaluating tasks. And if you're reading this, it means you have a mind and you are capable of evaluating truth claims using criteria. And we can continue for a bit longer in this discussion. What are criteria? I recall when I was a young man, I was trying to learn how to do high jumping. And that bar over which this amazing athlete is jumping is called a standard. So everybody has a standard that they need to try to get over in order to be understood to be telling the truth. So what are criteria? And they're standards on which a judgment or decision may be based. If you got a raise on your job recently, hopefully there were some criteria for that raise. Hopefully it wasn't just a flippant decision on the part of the businessman, because those kinds of decisions end up costing the business money. They shouldn't give raises to people who haven't met certain performance criteria, should they? These are characterizing marks or traits. And why are they needed? Why do we need to be bothered with criteria? Well, to answer these questions, when we say something is true, what convinces us? And how can we hope to convince others when we're talking and hoping to convey truth? We're hoping people have criteria they'll use to determine whether they should agree or not agree with the statement we've made. There's four major groups of criteria. There's the immediate criteria. There's the social criteria. There's philosophical criteria. And then there's divine revelation. Immediate criteria are things that have no mediation. In other words, they occur to you virtually instantaneously. Like an instinct. My instincts tell me this is true. Or gut feeling. My gut tells me this is true. I can feel it in my bones. Or my senses tell me this is true. I'm looking in my cup, and oh boy, it's still got something to drink. It tastes good. I didn't have to think about that. Intuition, it came to me in a flash. How many times have we maybe had our mother or father, I know this happened with me, seemed to know something. I couldn't figure out how they knew it. And I just had a hunch. I knew it. I knew you were in trouble. Or I knew you were going to call, or something like that. Without mediation is what the immediate criteria are about. How about the social criteria for understanding something to be true? It's our custom to say this is true. Or for generations we have held this to be true. Or everyone knows this is true. Now, this can be powerful, can't it? And it can also be scary. If you get enough people repeating a statement that doesn't correspond to reality, if they get swayed too much by a whole lot of other people who are repeating it for the same reason because they've been swayed, you can really get yourself off the mark of being based on truth. However, the power of social criteria is based on our trust that other people are applying some other criteria to making their decision about something being true, not just that everybody else believes it, or we've always believed that, or that's how we think in this culture. We hope they go deeper than that when they all begin agreeing that a certain statement must be true. It's probably worth mentioning, if I can go backwards, and I can't right now, but it's probably worth mentioning that that's how people came to believe that the earth was flat. They all agreed it was true. Now let's look at the philosophical criteria. I mentioned the one that I believe is our guiding light. This idea corresponds with reality, so it's true. A second way of looking at it philosophically is that, well, if a statement's true, it's something that works. And of course, we've used this. We've tried to determine what it took to fix something, and when we turned the screw the right number of turns, or we adjusted the right thing, or we put the right spices in it and it tasted like it was supposed to taste, okay, that's what works. So it's practical, but there are a lot of really important things that we need to know are true that we cannot test before we act. I live not too far from a busy highway. So the idea has come to my mind that what if we decide to play a little soccer game there? Not really, I'm being silly here, but if I use only a pragmatic approach to truth, then we have to go out there and play soccer and see if it works. Now, if somebody doesn't see us and they hit us, we may be paying the ultimate price for truth if we're stuck with the pragmatic way of thinking. Sometimes the stakes are just too high to depend upon whether it works or not. And then there's a third approach in philosophy, it's coherence. It's systematically consistent with what has been found to be probably true. So this is probably true. That's what people might say. And of course, this assumes that what has been found to be probably true isn't just based on what cohered with what people thought was true before they found that latest fact. You see, there's got to be a good starting point here. And if the starting point is it's consistent with what we believe to be true, we could have gotten off on the wrong foot from the very beginning. And then everything would cohere, more or less. And we would say it was true, but it wouldn't have been based on the true truth of the true measure of truth, and that is an idea corresponding with reality. And the fourth criteria is revelation. This is powerful because we're going to know that there are people with deep religious belief whose first court of appeal for any truth claim is to be able to say, I heard it from God. It's true because God has said it. And it's especially convincing for those who have a religion with a written book of revelations recorded by prior believers who believed they heard from God. And so divine revelation is quite powerful for large numbers of people. And regarding certain questions, it may be for believers the most convincing criteria.